I'm Lauren Elaine. I am the Executive Director of the Fierce Flower Poetry Center here at James Madison University. For those of you who don't know, I'm about to tell you, Fierce Flower is the nation's first academic center dedicated to Black poetry. We began with a conference in 1994, convened by our founder, inaugural Executive Director, Dr. Joanne Gavin, who is professor and we're so happy to still have her around. Right now, we are under my rule, good luck with that, everybody, but we are so excited to be convening our reading series, our seminars, our workshops, and to be partnering with amazing JME partners such as AAAD. I'm total MC mode, y'all. You don't have to bring it. It's Friday, right? Yeah. We need that energy. So, AAAD, our Africana Studies Department program minor, amazing presence here on campus, is at the end of its annual conference, year 13, convened by Dr. David Babcock, our new director of AAAD, Dr. Flora. We're so excited to have partners like that on campus. I want to shout out Cal. I want to shout out, who else do we need to shout out? All the people who just make things possible here. And I'm really excited because our roots, limbs, leaves, furious flower, you see how we wove together there. This event is us, our culmination, and for us, our reading of the semester. And I'm really excited that Shara McCallum is going to be presenting this evening. Shara McCallum is the author of 6 collections of poetry. Born in Jamaica to a Venezuelan mother and a Jamaican father, raised in Miami, Florida, McCallum takes up the complications of race, migration, history, and mythology in her writing. Those of you who were at her lunchtime workshop know that well. She is, whether she's writing from the perspective of a mermaid or Persephone, in her own voice or others, she's always questioning, and I quote, our responsibility to the past, our inheritance, and the choices we face and make as individuals, given the circumstances of our lives by history, through history. Her most recent collection, No Ruined Stone, won the 2022, sorry, I was a decade off there, 2022 Kirsten Wright Legacy Award for Poetry, and was a finalist for the 2022 UNT Rilke Prize. The collection imagines the trajectory of Scottish poet Robert Burns, what his life might have been like had he taken up a possible pathway, which was to accept a position on a plantation in Jamaica. Poetry worked out for him. He did not need to do that. However, he did consider it, and McCallum spent 3 years visiting archives and museums and libraries across Scotland and Jamaica, and then dives into a retelling in this novel in verse, told from multiple perspectives. The poems offer a searing insight to the intertwined and long-reaching legacies of colonialism, enslavement, and patriarchy. These poems journey lyrically and bravely across time and place, entering again and again the storied seas of history that we might continue to, and I quote Shara again, recover the wreckage of ourselves. I'm also here to testify personally to just a wonderful friend and human being and mentor and supporter, arts administrator, professor at Penn, Pitt Poetry Poet Laureate. We could spend a lot of time talking about all her awesomeness, but instead, I'm going to step away and let you experience it yourself. Give her a JME Fierce Flower.
Good afternoon. How's everyone feeling? Good. It is Friday.
It's Friday.
And you all could already be out doing many things, and you're here. So thank you, first of all, for showing up. Thank you, Lauren and Elle, Renee, and everybody associated with the Furious Flower Center, especially Joanne, for making it possible for me to be here. I want to thank the AAAD, now I know the proper acronym, organizers of the conference, and of course, the ongoing work that Africana centers do on campuses everywhere, not just at JMU. Thank you all for being here to listen. What I think I'll do is tell you a bit more about the project, read some poems, to kind of go in and out of it, and encourage you to think of some questions. I am going to read, but I also really love to have a conversation. So I hope you will think about things as you hear that you want to talk about. Trying to figure out where to put this. There to start. Hi, online audience. How's that? Yes. And I have a phone up here, not that I'm going to be tweeting, but I like to keep track of time. Also don't use social media, so I actually don't know how to tweet. So this project, as Lauren, really beautiful introduction. Thank you for that. As Lauren explained, came out of a real life thread of the story of the Scottish poet Robert Burns. I'm going to start with a question. How many of you know who Robert Burns is? Okay, great. Should old acquaintance be forgot? Does that sound familiar to you? Yes. Okay, so everyone knows who Robert Burns is. We're on the same page now, right? Okay, 18th century dude from Scotland who his work continues despite the fact you couldn't tell me even who he was, right? How about this? The best laid schemes of mice and men. Anybody heard that? Yes? Not John Steinbeck, Americans. Sorry to tell you. John Steinbeck is quoting the Scottish poet Robert Burns. I learned of Robert Burns when I was an undergraduate, and I was absolutely smitten by the British Romantic poets. Loved their work, absolutely adored Keats, especially Burns' Ode to a Mouse, from which those lines, the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after gley, that's where that comes from. Loved that poem. What it took some time for me to reckon with, and certainly when I was 18 years old, I was beginning with this reckoning, and I wasn't thinking of myself as a poet then, by the way, just a reader of poetry. I was actually pre-med when I went to university. Poetry was the thing I loved, but wasn't going to do. And I'm really thinking a lot when I say that, you know, students here in the audience, how sometimes the classes that you take and the things that you carry in you, sometimes it takes decades for those to find their fruition in you in a way. So fast forward to me becoming a poet, 2015, and I went to school in the 90s in the University of Miami. And I had become a poet by then, was going to Scotland to give a reading, the first time being in Scotland, in fact. And I was asked by someone I met why I was in Scotland. And I said, well, I'm here to give a reading, and I said my name. And the person said, oh, are you Scottish, your ancestry, McCallum? And I said, no. And I'm really not a cruel person, but sometimes when I'm in a mood, I try to let people guess where I'm from. You already know, because Lauren told you. This is a really fun parlor trick I have. In all my years, no one has ever guessed Jamaica, right? But in this case, this woman she was actually nonplussed when I told her, no, I'm actually from Jamaica. I'm a poet, so I'm here to give a reading. And she said, oh, then you must know the story of Robert Burns in Jamaica. So it's 2015. I had been a poet, teacher of poetry for many, many decades, and I very well didn't know the story of Burns in Jamaica, because many people don't know the story of Burns in Jamaica. The story is that he came very close to going to work as an overseer on a slave plantation. That's the story. The man who I associated, as with many of the British Romantic poets, with being products of the Enlightenment, believing in the rights of man, right? That's what I heard and loved in their poetry and its lyricism. I connected with that. He had seriously entertained this, and as Lauren mentioned, were it not for the very great luck that his first book of poems sold out, he would have gone. When I learned that story, it was like I write about this in the author's note, it was kind of like a thorn in my side. I couldn't let it go. And I was living in London at the time, and I remember not the day, but that I used to walk a lot when I was in London. I went back from this, I did my reading in Scotland, carried the story back with me, walking around, and something happened, and I just thought, what would have happened had he gone? That really led me on the path of writing this book. That's one way I could describe its formation. The other, I'd have to go back to that 17, 18-year-old girl who fell in love with the poetry of men I was quickly realizing would not have seen me. And if they had, I'm afraid they would not have seen me in the way I would have liked to have been seen. So that is also what I was carrying for literally 30-odd years, right? That personal history. Lauren mentioned that my father was Jamaican. My surname is patrilineal. So when people ask me when they meet me, are you Scottish? We've had sometimes some very interesting conversations because I have to point out that my surname is patrilineal. My father's father was a Black Jamaican. So if I'm Scottish, perhaps not in the way you are imagining. So all of that is what I brought to bear on these poems. My love of the poetry, my vexations with history and its occlusions, its silences, its omissions, and my reckoning with really the entirety of the Enlightenment that we continue to try to see our way to seeing into our lives in democracy that's imperfect now, in our reckoning with slavery and colonialism that we continue to try to face. All of those threads I brought to bear on this book. So I'm going to read some points. I think that's a good introduction, and I'm also really happy to talk about the research part of it, but I'd rather save that for the Q&A. Yeah? And I need water. Remember our conversation at dinner that we had lunch? That's for them. We had a nice chat about fear. The first and the last point in this book bear the title of the collection, and it comes from an epigraph from another Scottish poet. The epigraph is, "There are plenty of ruined buildings in this world, but no ruined stones." I decided to make it singular. So the title of this poem and the book is No Ruined Stone. I have to tell you, this is decidedly Shara speaking, because this is a series of poems after which you will not be hearing me speak again until the end of the reading. You might think you are, but actually they're all characters, and I'll tell you who's speaking when. But this is Shara at the outset of this project, speaking to none other than Robert Burns. This is the you of the poem. No ruined stone. You saturate the sight of those who come after, poets and painters alike. Your words invade my mind's listening, manacle my tongue when I try to speak. On all I backward cast my eye, and fear and cannot see. Who would I have been to you? What stone in the ruined house of the past? In this world, I am unloosed, belonging to no country, no tribe, no clan, not African, not Scotland. And you, voice that stalks my waking and dreaming, you, more myth than man, cannot unmake history. So why am I here, resurrecting you to speak, when your silence gulfs centuries? Why do I find myself on your doorstep, knocking, when I know the dead will never answer?
Wonderful.
whites is in this room. You can tell me afterward if you think this is true or not. I wrote that poem, I think it was the first poem I wrote, after 3 years of doing research, talking about this book and talking and thinking and writing notes, and I was beginning to really be worried. Like I was, just gonna keep talking about it and never write it, okay? But I realized that poem was the opening for me into the kind of dare that you hear at the end. After I say the dead will never speak, I go ahead and proceed to resurrect them indeed. The first half of this book is in the voice of Robert Burns. And I have that alternate speculative account of history, that imbrication into the actual historical record, play out. So from 1786, which is when he would have gone to Jamaica, to 1796 when he actually died, he dies in my book, all the things that were happening in the last decade of Burns' life, I transposed onto that plantation in Port Antonio, Jamaica. And I have to tell you some of these now, because I'm only going to read one poem in his voice. This is why I have such respect for novelists, right? You have to give so much of the story for the poem to even be making sense. But I really want to read in the second half of the book principally, but I'm going to tell you all the things that in short transpire. He keeps trying to be a famous poet. He keeps writing poems, even while he is working as an overseer on a plantation, that's correct. He's writing these poems and songs, like Old Lang Syne that I hummed the first bars of or that sang, and sending them back to his brother Gilbert in Scotland. In his lifetime, in my book, he is never famous. He just has the fate of all poets, really. He, of course, in his real life, so in Jamaica, we would say he had many baby mothers. Burns liked women, and he had relationships with many and had children with many, the real Burns. So, goes to a plantation in Jamaica. He has a multi-year relationship with an enslaved African woman named Nancy. Out of that relationship comes the birth of a child. And at one point, when the child is on her way, it's a girl, Burns goes to the owner of the plantation and asks if he can free Nancy and the child who is coming. And the owner reminds him, you don't have the money to get yourself off the rock that you're on. This is my property. And that's how Burns dies. I need you to understand that. He dies unable to free Nancy or the child. He dies an unfamous poet, not knowing that anything he's still pursuing is going to come to any meaning, and feeling utterly a failure. That's the only poem you're going to get from him, the story at the end of his life. Springbank, the name of the plantation, the real place. Place of memory, now in ruin. This point overlooking the sea, this cliff, this perch. Paradise to none but one who came, imagining he could be Lord, could be unmoored from class and caste. The way past is always the way through. After sea, over land we traversed rocky mountains, passages flanking us abutted by gullies, oversized plants casting their shadows. The horses' hooves trod and trod until stone gave way to field, and we entered the valley, approaching the great house from behind. That first sight rises still in my mind, bodying forth false promise. Look twice, or you leap once. Echoes, now fruitless. Oh, what foolishness lies in the heart of man, gleaming wish to be more, that waits for its chance to pounce and savage. So I just want to read only one poem in Burns' voice, thank you, because I really want to read from the second half of the book principally. The second half switches geography and speaker. We go from Jamaica, leave Burns in 1796. We flip to 1825 Scotland when the book second half opens. You remember I mentioned there was a child born on that plantation, born into slavery, Burns' child with Nancy. She grows up. Burns dies in 10 years, so he never sees her grow up. And what happens to her is what happened to so many enslaved African women, which is that she was raped by Douglas, the master of the plantation, in her late teen years. Out of that rape comes the speaker of the second half of this book. Her name is Isabella. She's born in Jamaica on that plantation, Black woman enslaved who looks white. And her mother, Burns' daughter and Nancy's daughter, dies in childbirth. She ends up being raised by her grandmother, Nancy, and escapes to Scotland. This is the story of how she gets there. Springbank. Was all the world I'd known. A child there, I was hers, Miss Nancy's kin. No matter this skin, these eyes, belonging to his face. Your father could not look at you without seeing disgrace, was the only answer she'd relent to offer. Even when her life waned, she would not unlock the past. Tell me what she'd said that made him let us go. Why he paid and paid to send us away and away. We left first for Kingston, and a door closed behind us, a door I was never meant to open again. In Kingston, my grandmother was passed off as my slave. By the time our ship docked in Greenock, she was my servant, and we threaded into a tale so tightly woven, no one would guess my origin. What she sacrificed was everything of herself to see me freed. But my father, you kent him and his world so intimately. What I've surmised will be no surprise. What Douglas understood was expedience. I was simply evidence. I needed to be erased. So I mentioned all those stories that I carried in me my whole life. One of them is the story that I hated the most, and it is the story of the tragic mulatta. Obviously, I should have reckoned with being a tragic mulatta directly far sooner than my 40th or so decade, or fourth, fifth decade on the planet. But I managed to only do it by looking at it sideways for a long time. Why did I hate it? I didn't want to be tragic, for one thing. Also didn't want to end up dead, since in all of the stories, apparently she doesn't get to live. She can belong to no world. But also because I fiercely claimed being Black as a young woman. And I didn't want to have to grapple with being not claimed by history. Of course I felt that. Many times I felt that. But I didn't want to feel it. I didn't want to look at it in such sustained, direct fashion, because it created too much pain. Until, of course, Isabella showed up and started talking to me in this book. And then I knew that I was going to have to give this story, in a way I wrote this book to give her a voice habitation. Her story. It's because I also was a student of literature, right? I did a PhD in African American and Caribbean literature. And I became aware that she was a glaring absence, right? And the only time she ever showed up, by the way, was for some like abolitionist trope. Basically, if you could look like me, maybe then white people would feel sorrier for Black people. It's the best that I could surmise, right? She looked more like, and that's what I gave to Douglas, right? She shows up. Genetics is a really screwy thing, people. Okay? She shows up looking like his mother, right? So this white man who was raped her mother as a child who looks like his mother, right? So Isabella's carrying all of that, but there's something else that she's carrying that I need to explain so you understand the sequence of poems you'll hear in her voice. It is that when she is speaking in this book, she's married a white Scotsman, and he doesn't know the truth of her ancestry. Remember Burns? In his death, he becomes the famous poet. He is just now the Burns. He's having this heyday, of course. Irony is a bitch, people. He's having a heyday as she's arriving in Edinburgh. He's being celebrated everywhere. Okay? She can't claim him because to do so would be to give herself up. All right? Slavery is ongoing. We need to explain that over and over again to people. 1825. There's real precarity for Isabella in passing for white. Thinking about all of that, you might ask, what then would ever possess her to ask the question she asks throughout her section? How can I continue to pass? Who have I betrayed? Right? I'll give you the answer. Her grandmother, Nancy, has died. The person who sacrificed everything for Isabella is gone. And Isabella is being haunted by memories, not only hers, but of her grandmother's passage from Africa to Jamaica, the Middle Passage. That's why. She's being haunted, driven to the point of almost madness by these memories and by the feeling that she has betrayed her grandmother and all of her African ancestors. That's her story, and I'm going to just say that and then let her speak. Memory. My first was sound, brought forth from her hands, wielding an axe, severing the necks of fowl, rending flesh from bone, that sound, torn from a throat, the cry she'd made as a child rendered orphan, stolen across an ocean, hungering to feed, ceaselessly to feed. The second was no sound, but fire, kindled of her hands, lighting kitchen walls, dredging blood from the sea's memory, blood tilling soil, blood, not even rain that falls and falls without end, not any water we cross, any riverbed stone can absolve. Inheritance. My grandmother taught me to fear the sea. She crossed it first as a girl. On that passage, her mother's voice lost, her language lost, each lullaby swallowed by the sea's cavernous din. The roiling waves she'd meet again and again in dreams, moaning, thrashing, waking years later, urging me each time, remember, with every surface, what lies beneath. In journeying here, what choice was I given but to morph, shape-shifting to what she feared, in learning to be more of you, more like you, mimicking your speech, your dress, lacing myself invisibly into your world, a shadow, passing seamlessly through cosseted rooms, walking dusk-lit streets, no one I see knowing her name, but yours everywhere, everywhere. How have I not betrayed her? In death, my life, erasing and erasing her. I always pick out points in advance and then I change my mind. So I mentioned that husband. I think maybe I'll have a poem. So you can hear most of the time, Isabella is speaking to Burns, by the way. I should have mentioned that. I was speaking to Burns in the beginning. I do get it. She's clearly a sort of avatar for Shara. But the precarity of her existence being born in the 19th century under the conditions she was, fundamentally different than the existential angst I feel at the end of the 20th century when I'm born. It's very different, those conditions. But some of it that I mentioned to you, my vexations with the Enlightenment, yes? How many of you have studied the Enlightenment thinkers, yeah? We are in Virginia, right? You should really, as Virginians or students in Virginia, if you haven't, you really should read Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia. Oh, yeah. Not just the Declaration of Independence, both actually. Read them next to each other, and you'll understand this point. Some of the ironies of my life, I think I put into this book, and the number of times I've met people who profess really not to be racist, most people don't think of themselves as being racist, I've come to understand, or bad people, right? We have protective mechanisms, our ego perhaps, that makes us think no matter what, we're good, right? So Isabella's married to a white Scotsman who of all things is an abolitionist. Yeah. And he's taking her to abolitionist meetings. I mean, as a writer, you really can screw with people. Yeah. And she's just not so sure whether or not his principles will hold up. So this is Isabella speaking to her husband, who she's trying to decide whether or not she will tell him the truth. Understand, she will be destitute if he throws her out. The conditions for any woman, especially a Black woman who's been passing, but really any woman in the 19th century who cannot own property, right, is to be destitute if your husband throws you out. So you need to understand all of this. Students, I'm a little obsessed with history, in case you haven't. So I want you to just get as much, forget the poetry. Leave here and want to read about history. No, I want to do poetry too. So this is her talking to her husband. Husband, for all the faith in argument, in principle, in reason, for all the books you hand me, bid me read, for all in the dark I pretend, for all the pursuit of equality, of righteousness and good, for all the rights of man, the vindication of woman, for all in the dark I pretend we are, for all the moral cause, abolition, the struggle for freedom, for all in the dark I pretend we are just, for all the history of heroes and foes, the victors and the vanquished, for all the talk and talk and talk, for all in the dark I pretend we are just one soul. What would it mean to see not love, not truth, not beauty, but who has been in your house? Who sleeping in your bed? I will read two more poems. This is a football school, so you'll be familiar. This is your 2-minute warning. They may be a little longer than 2 minutes. Nancy speaks one time in this book, Isabella's grandmother, and Isabella's grandmother orchestrated Isabella's passing to save her life and to allow her to escape slavery. But she comes back to her grandmother, she comes back to her granddaughter once in this book to speak to her when she recognizes that Isabella is being harmed by passing. And so this is her grandmother speaking. The word here, Duppy, is a Jamaican word. It means ghost, spirit. At the hour of Duppy and dream, Miss Nancy speaks. You think what lies before you asks more than you can bear. But I am with you now, as I was when you came into this world, your one eye looking forward, your other forever looking back. From the netherworld, you were flung into this one, squalling, full of that scent we could not wash away. Your mother's breath extinguished as you gulped your first, the call swaddling your face, till we lifted it, unveiling, beholding the unasked for. Girl child, cast down in a place of stone, of men who cannot see to see, do not hear what needs listening. Men who have riven borders and nations, and you in whom the rift has opened. Hear me, for I was there in the beginning, witness as you entered, as you came dusking, tearing all asunder, rending the fabric they call truth. Just close with the last point in the book. Isabella does make a decision, and I'll just tell you now. But I come back at the end, after the last point in the book, or the last few points where I hope it's clear what she decides. I come back and speak one more time. And this is, as I mentioned, the title of the collection, so I sort of open and close the book with the same title poem. I wrote this in Scotland, when after 3 years I went and I holed myself up in a flat there, and I wrote a third of this book in about 14 days. The first of the book of the poems that I wrote, you heard. This was the second. I wrote it on the anniversary of my own grandmother's death, and it has a dedication for her. It is also for all of my ancestors. Thank you again for listening. No ruined stone. When the dead return, they will come to you in dream, and in waking will be the bird knocking, knocking against glass, seeking a way in, will masquerade as the wind, its voice made audible by the tongues of leaves, greedily lapping as the waves' self-made fugue is a turning and returning. The dead will not then, nor ever again, desert you. Their unrest will be the coat cloaking you. The farther you journey from them, the more distance will maw in you. Time and place gulching when the dead return to demand accounting. Wanting and wanting and wanting everything you have to give, and nothing will quench or unhunger them as they take all you make as offering then tell you to begin again. Thank you. I know you must have some comments, questions. I saved time.
Story of the research.
Sure. So there are so many stories of research, but what I would say for me was I reread everything Robert Burns wrote, all his poems, prose, songs. I listened on repeat to his songs sung by a Scottish singer. Her name is Edie Reader. And this was my way of trying, in a way, to get all of that language in so that I could write in his voice. I also went to Scotland and I went to the archives. I held manuscripts that Burns had written in his own hand. I retraced his life from birth to death, literally went to Ayrshire, made my tour of Scotland. It is really lovely to have a project like this, just so you know, because you can go and travel and be like, I'm doing work. But I was serious about this. I went everywhere Burns touched. And I spoke with everybody, like not just academics, though those especially, because they were the experts. And I said to anybody who would listen in Scotland, hey, I have this idea of your national hero. What do you think? I was amazed by the reception I got. The Scots were incredibly open to somebody pained by this history, but open to this stranger showing up on their doorstep, stravaiging, as the Scottish word is, through their country, who was big and boasty enough to think she could do this. So I was really amazed by that. I am Jamaican, but by the way, that doesn't make me, like through osmosis, an expert in 18th century Jamaican plantation slavery, just to know. So I also went to the archives in Jamaica. I know Kingston, and I know Port Antonio. I actually spent a summer in Port Antonio. It's why perhaps I was so struck by this too, not just because I'm Jamaican and carry the ancestry I do, but because I always have felt great connection to Port Antonio. And, but the past there is what I was trying to read on that land. And it passed hundreds of years, you know, before I'm born. So I went to the archives there as well. I read history, and I held, and I talked to Elle about this. I went to the archives and I held a bill of sale for the first time in my life. It was such a difficult experience. It's hard to talk about it without reliving in some way what that felt like. But I needed to have what happened to me happen, I think, because that's what gave birth to Nancy, you know? And I saw the name of a child on that bill of sale. And I'm a mom, and I can't talk about it. That's that. No more of that one.
Yeah.
Just to say, I needed to be that afraid, unsettled, knowledgeable, pierced in order to do this work. Remember I said to you I ran away from writing about this subject for a long time? That's kind of true and kind of a lie. I mean, I did write a whole series of mermaid poems, you know, so, but this was different. I was terrified of writing about the violence of this history. And I knew that there was no way to avoid it. The sexual violence of it, just absolute abject cruelty and torturous violence of it. And the archives, the research, they girded me. They gave me strength to say, I could do this. And they also reminded me that they're incomplete. You know, that the women in particular that I create in this story, they really don't exist in fleshed out ways in the archives. And that was confirmed when I did this research. You know, like I went looking for Isabella, she's not there. You know, even Nancy, hard pressed to find her other than a name on a piece of paper with a $sign or a pound sign, as it were, next to her name. She has no history, no voice. So I think the archives gave me the sort of like ethos in a way that I needed. I'm not a historian, but I love pretending I am. And then also reminded me of why I needed to write this book.
I'm so
Joanne,
I'm
yeah.
so interested in Nancy. I
Yeah.
know that this is a fictional
Yes.
grandmother, but in terms of your research,
Oh, yeah,
where would you place her before she got to Jamaica?
it's Ghana.
To
Yes,
Ghana?
to Ghana, yeah. I mean, I know the ancestry because of the stories we tell. That's how.
Okay.
So because we tell the Nancy stories, I know that, you know, the African ancestry in Jamaica culturally is a Kana Shanti.
Mhm.
That's what I know from storytelling, you know? I also I'm not like a crazy person about privacy. I know it's a waste of time. But two of my sisters who carry very similar ancestry did our DNA. And so I have also verification,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
But I knew the history through story, through family story. Yeah. So she comes from Ghana, present day Ghana. That's how I knew it. Yeah. Thanks for that
Yeah.
question. Yeah.
I was wondering in your imaginings,
Yeah.
if you sort of picture these characters, the way they live everyday life,
Yes.
what they ate,
Yes.
they wore,
Yes.
you know, the kind of songs they sang, the
Absolutely.
kind of conversations that they had. You know,
Yeah.
can you expand on the
Sure.
image that-
Yeah. And of course, you know, I have some points in here where there are references to all of that. So, yes, I did research into the layout of the plantation so I could visualize where Burns's home would be, where Nancy and Burns would have even been able to come together on that plantation. Where's the great house? Where are the, you know, quarters for enslaved people? That was part of it. The songs, the records of those, they're hard to come by. But I have a song in here, which I will just read it to you. And you can look it up on YouTube and you can hear it. It starts as about a section. It's from the Iwe in Ghana, the language Iwe and people. And it's a lullaby, it's Tutu Gobi. And I will just read the English that I transliterated or rendered in a way. My dear one, your grandmother isn't home. Who are you crying for? Don't cry, little child. Oh, my dear one, don't cry. And I loved that in Iwe, the word nana, it means grandmother and mother, both. So you can't see this when I'm reading it, but this is grand/mother. So that was one of the gifts of research that I came across, and I was trying so hard to find it, but it is harder. The story of Nanny of the Maroons really influenced my thinking about Nancy as well. So Nanny of the Maroons, if you don't know, a fierce warrior in Jamaican history. And she was reported to have basically defeated the British many times, kept basically Africans in the interior, what's called cockpit country. So when you think of Jamaica, if you've never been or you're not from Jamaica, I guess you imagine a beach, right? I'm just gonna guess that, yeah? So the place I'm from, there's a mountain in my backyard that's about 7,500 feet. In 1 mile from the ocean rises, right? So it's a mountainous country too. It's not just a beach. And into that interior, free Africans remained free throughout the history of Jamaican slavery and would fight off the Spanish, then the British. The story is complicated. Eventually, they make treaties, which are incredibly sad to say that the Maroons end up making treaties to preserve their freedom and sending back runaway slaves, right? But Nanny in her time is like this amazing warrior. I know that they now have the warrior king, right, queen,
Yeah.
right? And I know a little bit about her history as well, but Nanny is that kind of a figure. So I thought about just all the Jamaican women, and I mean, you know, we talked about this, Lauren. This just is the women we know, you know. In Jamaican, we have a phrase, "Shilikubiba which translates to like, she might seem small, but she's fierce. You know? And so it was partly that, I think, that I was bringing a lot of like oral history in a way that I feel is the history of these women that are the women I know, and creating a life out of that. Songs, speech, yeah. Yes,
Question that you give to Isabella's poem to her husband.
yeah,
You speak about women not being able to own land. To me, what I heard when you said that was the implication that culture existed in Scotland. I had been told for years that it did not. Is this a myth or is there
but what existed in Scotland, I couldn't hear.
culture?
Coverture. Which, could you define that for me? I'm not familiar with that phrase, that word.
Okay, when a woman marries under culture, when a woman marries, she becomes legally a part of her husband, loses her own legal status,
Yes,
and therefore cannot own land or sign legal documents without his signature on it.
okay, I see what you're asking now. So I'm not a legal expert, so I don't want to misstep and overstep what I know. But I know in the general, that in Scotland at that time, it's under British law, because the Scots by then, if you know Culloden, has already happened, it's part of the UK, right? It's still part of the UK, at least, I don't know, me and Nicola Sturgeon just up and left, so who knows if he'll ever be independent. Not that I have a vote, but I have a vested interest at this point. But to get back to your question, I don't know the ins and outs of it. What I do know is that according to British law, no, none of those women had the same rights to own property. They wouldn't have been able to have, that's the existence of dowries. You're not getting your wealth to transfer and have ownership over that wealth. So Isabella, who is disinherited, basically, right, by all these nations and peoples from whom she is born, would not have been able to survive. Most of the women in that position would have become prostitutes, basically. That's what most likely her other existence that would have happened would have been that. Yeah. Sophia.
So I had a question. I should have asked it earlier because now I have two.
Okay.
But,
I'll take two.
So my first question was, what about you and Robert Burns now? Like you talk about, the relationship that you had poetically
Yeah.
with him as a young person, and I wonder about that now after doing this project. And then my other question is about language and about varieties of English
Mm.
and about non-standard
Mhm.
versions and how how you're working with kind of multiple Englishes in
Yeah.
this work.
Yeah. So I'll take the first one first, and then I'll come back to the question of language. Burns, people will be surprised to know, if you get the book, you'll know it, is a complicated figure in my rendering of him. People are surprised that I would have so much compassion for him, I suppose. If I wasn't truly able to see that, I don't think I could have written a whole series of monologues in his voice, right? So what I was trying to do in many ways was I used his language in here, cast it deliberately to show from his vantage point in the first half of the book what this world would have looked like to him, how he would have experienced it. It is an act of ventriloquism, right? The monologue is a ventriloquial performance. So if I am successful, I will convince you by the first half that you should feel sad for Robert Burns. He has mental illness. That's writ large here. He's struggling. He wants to be a good man. He makes a very, very stupid, bad, ill-informed choice to implicate himself in slavery. But he's trapped and cannot get out once he makes that decision. So by the end of the first half, I want you to feel that. I want you to feel the horror of all that for him, as well as his noting in kind of the background what else is going on. Then Isabella speaks. She picks up huge amounts of echoes of his language. She begins to throw it back at him, right? And I want you to then be able to hear what I hear is the profound irony of the language, right? Maybe throughout you can hear it, right? Because the thing is, the book turns on dramatic irony, turns on it. We know things the whole time that Burns and Isabella do not. Okay, we know slavery will end, for example, Isabella does not know that, right? We know Burns is going to become famous, right? The character Burns does not know that. We know that the arguments that Douglas, for example, the master of the plantation, makes for slavery were readily made in that time. And now, from the vantage point of the present, they sound unbelievable, right? So there's this kind of double effect that I'm hoping for in using Burns' own language, Burns' own biography. I want both. This is my nature. I tell my students this all the while. I wish to have my cake and eat it. Do not want to only have cake to look at, you know? And so I think it's possible because of poetic craft. I think you can wield the lyric and the dramatic mode and the narrative. I think poems can do this. They can allow us this like multiplicity of tonal and argumentative registers that we can pick up. On top of that, I wanted to work with different languages, yes. Because that wasn't sufficient to me, apparently. I was not feeling that was enough of a challenge, you know? So here is not English, but Scots. We sleek it cowering timorous beastie. Oh, what a panic sin thy breastie. We would not run away so hasty with bickering prattle. I would be laid to run and chase thee with murdering paddle. Do you understand a word I just said? How about if I slow it down? We, tiny, sleek it, sleek, cowering in the corner, timorous, like timid, beastie, little beast. This is the opening to Ode to a Mouse. This is the poem, you know it. This was the poem I loved. And why? I can promise you, because I love that Scots. That is why. It was not just the grandeur of the argument that he gets at by the end. Of course, that's brilliant. It's the Scots. Who doesn't want to say, we, sleek it, cowering, timorous beastie? If you don't, come talk to me because something is wrong, right? Like, it's just a wonderful thing to have in your mouth, right? Those sounds, to say them. So I wanted to use Scots in this book. And you all don't know, but I also speak Jamaican patois, right? So I've written poems in patois. And so I just thought, I can do this. Again, the dare that you give yourself as a writer. I will just read enough Scots until I have it in me. It'll just be like all in me, and then it will just come out, right? It comes out in moments, you know? I don't want to be parodic. I don't actually speak Scots, but I had enough to be able to do it. So that's interesting to me too, always. The registers of language that we have access to, everything from the oral to the written in this case, because Scots, like patois, is much more an oral language. You know what's better when languages don't get written down? This is Shara's theory, okay? They're far more poetic. What do I mean by that? More idiomatic, more metaphoric, more musical. Once they become the language of commerce, law, they are deadened. The language is killed by that. So there's this interest I have always as a poet in that tension between the written, the oral, and how can I get that actually on the page? I hope I answered that question. Okay.
Great.
Yes.
So,
My fellow Ode to a Mouse lover.
I mean, laps for mantises, so all of this.
We're speaking the same language, yes.
But by the way, the poems are absolutely amazing, especially the one about driving beneath the ocean, sinking the seas. But here is my question. One of the things that obsesses me about the way that Black feminine bodies are considered during slavery is the management of reproductivity.
Right.
And so it's a central feature, a central thread.
Absolutely.
Correct? So I want to ask a question about ruining plot.
Okay, okay.
Does Isabella make the same kinds of decisions about reproductivity with any kind of joy, with any kind of liberation, even as she is caught with a logical capacity that feels very Noah Larson?
It is. It's indebted to Noah Larson, so thank you for hearing that. But I don't want her to have that fate. So I don't want it for her. I love Passing and Quicksand, both. They were really the only books actually that I can cite that I read in those years that I thought she gets it. Right? She understood the interiority of the woman who can pass, the Black woman who can pass. Can I read a poem to you as my answer?
Yes.
Okay. Because I could tell you, for one thing, I'm gonna say, Isabella does make a choice, and I'll just ruin the plot, because it's a book of poems, it doesn't matter. Really, it's because you're gonna have to read them again and again. So like, once you know the story, that shouldn't be where the pleasure resides, it's figuring out the story. But the reason I say this is, she decides she cannot pass, and it's because she's pregnant. And she doesn't want that for her child. She doesn't. So whatever the cost is, Isabella has made her choice. And this is the point in which I think you will hear that, where she claims it in a very different kind of way. She's not gonna either be pushed or jump off of a building in my book. Those of you who haven't, I'm sorry, I am ruining the book. That is a proper novel where maybe it matters. I think of mine as an improper novel. And since it's poems, they're meant to be heard again and again. Anyway, this is Holyrood, 1826. Spring again, and the hills are lit with gorse. Each day I walk from the city's center, leave behind its cobblestones the closes stink, the everywhere gray of brick on brick, to take in this yellow flowering, its profusion, like the Puyi of my childhood, unfettered. I climb rocky paths to the abbey's ruins, from whose heights I peer through windowless rooms out to sea. Here, the past silts the present, salts air. How many times have I made this ascent? How many must I make it more? Searching the horizon, scouring clouds for signs of how they lived and died, trying to read truthfully my inheritance, what now I am meant to pass on. No longer a girl, it is time I turn from all the given names to learn what land knows, how forged in fire hills are birthed, how loke and sea and sky converge inside the eye's trickery. No longer a child, I must find a way to stand in this place and every other not earthed for me.
Beautiful.
To the end of our reading and our conference, I want to use this opportunity to preview March 23rd at Golden Home, where Liz Taylor will be reading. We will also have an open mic, so if you feel inspired and write some poems, I'm looking at you, Intro to Poetry people. There's an open mic. I also want to point out that Shara will be selling, and so she's not selling, but she'll be signing books. The bookstore will be selling books, and Shara will be signing them, so feel free to continue the conversation, get a book signed, and stuff together.
Yes, I thank you, Lauren. I just had to take this opportunity to say, first of all, that was an amazing reading. This is the kind of thing that is my gift, that I am no longer executive director of Furious Flower, that I get to come to these amazing readings and enjoy them. And I don't have to worry about anything, because I know that it's going to be done well. So, would you all do this for me? Would you give Shara McCallum the kind of thank you that we're known for at JMU. Would you stand up and applaud her? Would you come up? Oh, would you come up? Oh. You know, I was a little part of the program.
I know.
This was a little, it was selfish on my part. I could have given you this earlier, but I wanted to do this in front of an audience. And so I want you both to have this gift from me and Hugo Cole from, it's the Furious Flower ring. Only those poets who are superlative get this ring. And if you would open it and show your ring, I wanted them to understand that this is a continuous gift to me that they give. And I wanted them to feel it and for you all to see it. So, please.
You got me messed up in here.
Good job, y'all.
And this could not be a better legacy for me. So thank you all so much.
Thank you all for coming. We can't promise there'll be presents at every reading, but show up and maybe. Thank you so much. I believe there's passport stamping over there, book signing over there, and sticker, a AAAD reception afterward as well. Thank you so much, everyone.